The gates were already open when I arrived. That should have been my first warning. The Osei estate didn't leave its gates open. Not at night. Not for anyone who hadn't been summoned, announced, and approved by at least 3 different people. I had worked inside those walls long enough to know that the gates were a symbol, not just of security, but of control. Of who belonged and who didn't. And I had never belonged. My name is Kofi Mensah. I was 34 years old, a mechanic from Accra's Nima district, the son of a man who fixed engines for a living and died with grease still under his fingernails. I drove a second-hand Toyota pickup that made a sound like a dying animal every time I shifted into 3rd gear. I owned 2 good shirts, one for church, one for funerals, and I kept them both ironed because my mother had taught me that dignity costs nothing. That night, I stood outside the Osei gates in the rain, holding a small envelope that had been handed to me by a woman I had grown to love more than I ever thought possible. Her name was Osei. She was 51 years old, the founder and CEO of Osei Group Holdings, one of the largest privately held conglomerates in West Africa. Her face had appeared on the cover of Forbes Africa twice. She owned properties in Lagos, Johannesburg, London, and Dubai. Her children had never taken public transportation. Her dogs ate better than most of the families in my neighborhood. And she had fallen in love with me. Not the other way around, though God knows I had tried to resist it. She had fallen for me first, slowly, quietly. The way a woman who has never been truly seen finally recognizes someone who looks at her without wanting something in return. But that night, standing in the rain outside her gates with her handwritten letter in my pocket, I wasn't thinking about love. I was thinking about what her oldest son had said to me the last time we spoke. "If you ever come back here," Victor Osei had told me, his voice low and sharp like a blade, "I will make sure you regret every single day you thought you were good enough for this family." I should have turned around. I didn't. Because the letter Abena had sent wasn't a love letter. It was a warning, and it said only 4 words. "Kofi, I need you." I had never ignored those words before. I wasn't going to start now. But what I didn't know, what none of us knew that night, was that by the time the sun rose over Accra, nothing about the Osei family would ever be the same again. If you've never heard a story like this before, stay with me, because this one will change the way you see everything. I met Abena Osei 14 months before that night, and not in the way you might expect. There was no glamorous introduction, no charity gala, no chance encounter at a fine restaurant where I happened to be dining above my station. I met her because her car broke down on the Spintex Road at 7:43 in the morning, in the middle of a traffic jam that stretched all the way back to the Tete Kwoshi roundabout, and she was already late for a board meeting that she couldn't reschedule. Her driver had called for roadside assistance. The roadside assistance company had called my workshop. My apprentice had been sick that week, and I had gone out alone. I remember pulling up behind the black Mercedes S-Class and noticing 2 things immediately. First, that the car was worth more than my entire workshop and everything in it combined. Second, that the woman sitting in the back seat was not on her phone, not checking emails, not doing any of the things that rich people in expensive cars always did when they were kept waiting. She was looking out the window, just watching the city move around her, the bread sellers weaving between cars, the school children running along the roadside, the man pushing a cart of plantains through the exhaust fumes with the slow dignity of someone who had no choice but to keep moving. She was watching them the way I watched them, like they mattered. That was the first thing that surprised me about Abena Osei. I fixed the car in 22 minutes. Alternator belt, clean job, straightforward, no complications. When I was done, I knocked on the driver's window and told him the repair details and the price. He nodded without looking at me and started reaching for his wallet. But before he could open it, the back window rolled down. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was measured, unhurried. The voice of a woman who was used to rooms going quiet when she spoke, but who had learned not to need that. It was a simple fix, madam, I said. The belt was worn. You'll want to have the full electrical system checked within the next 2 weeks. She looked at me then. Not the way people in expensive cars usually looked at mechanics, that glance that skims the surface and moves on. She actually looked at me. You have your own workshop? She asked. Yes, madam. Mensah Auto, off the Nima Road. Do you do commercial fleet maintenance? I paused. I haven't had the contracts for it, but I have the capacity. She nodded slowly, as if she was filing something away. Then she said, Give your card to my driver. And the window went up. I didn't think much of it at the time. Rich people said things like that the way they said we should have lunch sometime, words that floated and never landed. I gave my card to the driver and drove back to Nima with grease on my forearms and the smell of rain-wet asphalt following me all the way home. 3 days later, her personal assistant called. They wanted Mensah Auto to service 6 company vehicles for a trial period of 90 days. I hired 2 mechanics within the week. The contract brought me into the orbit of Osei Group Holdings in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not into the mansion, not at first, but into the company's world. The logistics division had a fleet of 12 vehicles that were constantly breaking down. The previous maintenance company had been overcharging and underperforming for years. Within 6 weeks, I had identified every recurring fault, established a servicing schedule, and cut the downtime by 60%. Word traveled the way good work always does, quietly, through the people who notice. It was Abena herself who summoned me to the Osei estate for the first time. Not the office, not the company headquarters on the airport road. The estate, her home. I remember the drive up to the main entrance. The iron gates, black and gold, taller than any wall I had grown up near, swung open silently as the guard waved me through. The driveway was lined with jacaranda trees, their purple flowers falling in slow arcs across a lawn so perfectly maintained it looked painted. The house itself came into view after a long, gentle curve, a colonial-style mansion, white and imposing, with wide verandas and tall windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back like a warning. I parked where the guard pointed and sat in my truck for a moment. The marble reflected my worn tires. I got out and walked toward the entrance, and I noticed that the door was already open. Not propped, not ajar, but held open by a house steward in pressed trousers who gave me a look I would come to recognize very well over the following months. Not quite contempt, not quite welcome. Something in between, precise and calibrated, that said, You may enter, but you are not one of us. I entered anyway. The interior was everything the exterior promised. Marble floors that reflected my dusty work boots. High ceilings hung with crystal fixtures that scattered light in precise geometric patterns across surfaces of dark wood and cream fabric. Gold-framed portraits lined the corridor, 3 generations of Osei, each face more carefully composed than the last. The smell was polished wood and imported flowers, and something faintly warm, like cinnamon candles extinguished only moments before. I followed the steward past 2 sitting rooms and into a wide, airy office at the rear of the house that opened onto a garden terrace. Abena was standing at her desk when I came in. Not sitting, standing, working on her feet the way I worked in the pit under a car. She was wearing reading glasses and holding a report, and she set both down when she heard me enter. Mr. Mensah, she said, thank you for coming. Of course, madam. Please sit. She gestured to the chairs across from her desk. And call me Abena. Madam makes me feel like someone I stopped being 20 years ago. I sat. She sat. And for the next 45 minutes, she asked me questions about mechanical systems, fleet logistics, parts procurement, and supplier relationships that told me she had done more research than I expected. She wasn't asking to test me. She was genuinely curious. That was the second thing that surprised me about Abena Osei. When the meeting was over and she was walking me back toward the entrance, she paused at a window that looked out onto the garden. A gardener was working near the rose bed. An older man bent over the soil with slow, careful hands. "That's Emmanuel," she said. "He's been here 23 years. She was quiet for a moment. Sometimes I think he knows this house better than any of us. I didn't answer right away. I looked at Emmanuel. Then I said, "Some people put everything they have into places that will never put their names on the door." She turned to look at me. I hadn't meant to say it out loud. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly right." She held my gaze a second longer than necessary. Then she looked away and thanked me again for coming. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I saw as I was leaving. A shadow at the top of the staircase, looking down. I only caught a glimpse before they moved back into the hallway. But it was enough. The eyes that had watched me leave that day were not warm, and they were not curious. They were already calculating something. Over the next 3 months, my visits to the estate became more frequent. The official reason was always the vehicles. A new fault here, a parts discussion there. But the visits grew longer. The conversations expanded. Abena had a habit of walking me to the door herself, rather than having the steward do it. And somehow those walks became 20-minute conversations about things that had nothing to do with engines. She told me about the company her late husband had founded, Osei, who had died 6 years ago of a heart attack at 61. She spoke about him with a careful kind of affection, the way you speak about someone you loved and also outgrew, and who loved you and couldn't quite follow where you were going. She told me about her 3 children. Victor, the eldest at 29, who ran the real estate arm of the group, and who had, in her words, his grandfather's stubbornness and none of his grace. Serena, 26, who was finishing a master's degree in international finance in London and who called twice a week without fail. And Kwame, 23, who was still figuring out what he wanted and who, Abena said with a tired affection, needs more time than any of us can give him. She told me about the loneliness of the estate, how a house full of staff and meetings and obligations could still feel like the quietest place in the world, how she had stopped eating dinner in the dining room 2 years ago because the silence at that long table was louder than any argument. I don't know when she stopped asking about cars and started asking about me. I noticed it one afternoon when I was telling her about my father, how he had taught me that a man who understood how things worked could never be entirely powerless, because broken things always needed someone willing to fix them. She had laughed, a real laugh, not a polished social one, and said, "Your father was a philosopher." "He was a mechanic," I said. "Same thing in the end." She laughed again. And I realized, sitting across from her in that terrace garden, with the Accra skyline visible in the distance and the smell of her coffee drifting between us, that I had never once felt out of place in her presence. Only out of place in her house. That distinction mattered, but I didn't understand yet how much it was going to cost both of us. The first time Victor Osei spoke to me directly, it was not polite. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had come to the estate to deliver the quarterly fleet report, a printed document that Abena had specifically requested in paper form because she preferred reading reports without a screen. I arrived at 3 o'clock, 5 minutes before the appointed time. Victor was in the driveway. He was standing beside a white Range Rover, talking to a man in a suit, and when he saw my truck pull through the gates, he paused in the way that people pause when they see something they didn't expect and immediately dislike. He was tall, taller than me, with Augustine Osei's broad shoulders and his mother's careful eyes, though on Victor those eyes had lost whatever softness they might once have carried. He wore a navy shirt and cream trousers, and shoes that probably cost more than my monthly income. His jaw was set. His posture was the posture of a man who had never been made to wait for anything. He dismissed the suited man with a word and walked toward me. "You're the mechanic," he said. It wasn't a question. "Kofi Mensah," I said, "I have an appointment with your mother." "I know who you have an appointment with." He looked at my truck with the specific kind of contempt that doesn't need to raise its voice. "You've been coming here a lot. Your mother contracted my company for fleet maintenance." "For the company cars," he said, "not for the estate." "Your mother sets the schedule," I said. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My mother is a generous woman, sometimes too generous. She has a habit of extending hospitality to people who mistake it for something more significant." I held his gaze. I said nothing. He stepped closer. "I've done some research on you, Mensah. Mensah Auto, Nima Road. 8 employees, no financing, no collateral, no formal qualifications beyond a technical certificate. You're good at what you do. I respect that." He paused. "Stay in your lane." He walked back toward the house without waiting for my response. My hands didn't shake. I had grown up in Nima. I had met Victor Osei 100 times, in 100 different bodies, wearing 100 different expensive shirts. I knew exactly what he was. What I didn't know yet was how far he was willing to go. I walked to the front entrance with the report under my arm and waited for the steward, and I told myself it was fine. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Abena had seen the exchange from the window. When I was finally shown into her office, her face was composed and professional, but there was something underneath it, something careful and controlled, like a fire behind glass. She took the report. She thanked me. She offered coffee, which I accepted. And then, after a silence that lasted a little too long, she said, "My son is protective." "He has every right to be," I said. She looked at me over her coffee cup. "You are very patient, Kofi." "My father used to say that patience isn't weakness. It's just anger that knows how to wait." She smiled. Small, almost sad. "I'll remember that," she said. It was Serena who first said what everyone else was pretending not to think. She had returned from London for the long Easter weekend, and Abena, in a move that either showed great courage or a complete misreading of the room, had invited me to a small family dinner. The official reason was to discuss the expansion of the fleet maintenance contract to include the Kumasi Logistics Division, a business dinner. Perfectly appropriate. I arrived at 6:30. The dining room was everything I had imagined from the outside. A table that seated 14 set for 6. Bone china. Crystal glasses. Silver cutlery so polished you could see your distorted reflection in every piece. The chandelier above us glowed warmly, but the room felt cold. The scent of roasted lamb and good wine filled the air, underneath the sharper, cleaner note of expensive candles. Abena was already seated at the head of the table. She rose when I entered, a gesture so natural and unperformed that I don't think she was aware she'd done it. The steward showed me to a seat at her right hand, which was not where a business associate would have been placed, and which Victor, seated directly across from me, noticed immediately. Serena was next to Victor. She was lighter in manner than her brother, quick to smile, quick to assess. She shook my hand warmly and asked 3 questions in the first minute, each one layered on top of the last. How long had I been in the industry? Did I have formal engineering training? What was the most complex repair I'd ever done? I answered all 3. She nodded and leaned back and gave me a look that was almost approving. Kwame arrived 15 minutes late, slightly breathless, in a shirt that was inside out, until Serena told him with a look, and he ducked behind his chair to fix it. He shook my hand with genuine good humor, asked me if I followed football, and seemed entirely unbothered by my presence. Victor spoke mostly to his mother about business, figures, acquisitions, a land deal that was pending in the Volta region. He addressed me once, formally, asking about turnaround times for the Kumasi vehicles, and accepted my answer with a nod that communicated nothing. It was after the main course, when the table had relaxed slightly, that Serena leaned forward with a glass of wine in her hand and the careful precision of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. "Kofi," she said pleasantly, "how would you describe your relationship with our mother?" The table went quiet. Victor's fork paused. Abena's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. A barely visible straightening that might have been tension or might have been readiness. "Professional," I said, "with respect, I hope." Serena smiled. "That's a very careful answer." "It's an accurate one," I said. "Our mother doesn't usually invite mechanics to family dinners," she said still pleasantly. "No offense." "None taken." "Then what is it about you specifically that made this dinner necessary?" Abena set down her glass. "Serena?" "I'm asking a genuine question, Mother." "I know what you're asking." Abena's voice was quiet, not sharp, measured. The voice of a woman who had sat in enough boardrooms to know that the person who raises their volume loses the room. "And this is not the appropriate time." Serena held her gaze for a moment, then she sat back. "Of course, The table recovered slowly. Kwame asked about the football. Victor returned to his business figures. The lamb was finished, and a dessert appeared, and the evening moved forward the way evenings do when everyone has decided, by mutual and unspoken agreement, to let the moment pass. I drove home at 10 that night with the city noise washing over me and a feeling in my chest I couldn't entirely name. I knew what Serena had been doing, what she had been protecting. I didn't blame her for it, but something had shifted that night, and we both knew it. And the question that hung in the air above that beautiful cold dining table, the question nobody had asked out loud, was already growing roots. Abena told me she loved me on a Wednesday evening in November. We were sitting in the garden terrace, which had become, over the course of a year, the place where we were most ourselves. The city lights were beginning to appear in the distance, and the garden smelled of rain and night flowers, and the coffee she always kept warm in the small carafe on the table between us. She had been telling me about a decision she was facing, a restructuring of the company's West African operations that would require significant sacrifice from one division to strengthen another. She talked about it the way she always talked about hard things, clearly, without self-pity, with that focused calm that was one of the first things I had admired about her. And then she stopped, mid-sentence. She looked at me, and she said, "Kofi, I think I love you." There was no prelude, no build-up. She said it the way she made decisions, directly, once she had considered all the angles and arrived at what was true. I sat with it for a moment. The crickets in the garden continued their conversation. The city glowed in the distance. I said, "I know." She blinked, then a small, surprised laugh. "You knew?" "I thought I might be wrong," I said, "but I hoped I wasn't." "And you?" she asked. Quietly, I looked at her, at the face I had watched across that table for 14 months, at the woman who had looked out of her car window at bread sellers and seen them, at the person who had walked me to the door every time because she wasn't ready for the conversation to end. "Yes," I said. "For a long time now." She reached across the small table and put her hand over mine. We didn't say anything else for a long time, and that silence, that warm, unhurried, honest silence, was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced. But I already knew what was coming. Because some truths are beautiful in the garden and brutal in the house. And the house, with all its marble and crystal and gold-framed portraits, was watching. The story of how Abena Osei fell in love with a mechanic from Nima traveled through the family the way bad news always does. Faster than it should. Further than it needed to. I don't know who saw us that evening in the garden. It might have been the steward. It might have been one of the groundskeepers. It might have been someone looking out from an upstairs window. The way someone had looked down at me on my very first visit to this house, with eyes that were already calculating something. What I know is that within 3 days of that November evening, Victor called a family meeting. I know this because Abina told me. She told me in a text message that was precise and controlled and carried underneath it something I hadn't heard from her before. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to weariness. The weariness of a woman who has built an empire and knows that even empires have walls you can't knock down with money. Victor has called a meeting. I wanted you to know before you heard it from somewhere else. I am not afraid of the conversation. I am not asking you to wait. I am asking you to trust me. I read that message 4 times, and then I put my phone in my pocket and went back to work. The family meeting took place on a Friday evening, and I was not invited, which was exactly what Victor had intended. He had framed it as a routine family gathering, a quarterly check-in on the estate finances, the kind of meeting Abena attended as a matter of course. He had not told her the real agenda in advance. That was his first mistake. Abena told me about it afterward, sitting in the garden with untouched coffee in front of her, and the careful look of someone who is processing something they had both expected and hoped would never arrive. Victor had opened the meeting with the real estate figures, as expected. Serena had presented a summary of the London investments. Kwame had been there because Victor had insisted on it, which alone should have told Abena something. Then, 40 minutes in, Victor had set down his folder and said, "I think we need to talk about Kofi Mensah." Serena had known. Kwame had been surprised, which told Abena he hadn't been briefed. Victor had spoken for 11 minutes. Abena had counted, because that was the kind of woman she was. He had presented what he called a concern, the excessive familiarity of the mechanic who maintained their company vehicles, the inappropriate frequency of visits to the estate, the potential reputational risk to the Osei name, the concern, and this was where his voice had taken on a deliberate, almost rehearsed gravity, about whether someone from that background, with those resources, those connections, those limitations, could possibly have pure intentions toward a widow of Abena's wealth and stature. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't used cruel words. He had been careful and clinical, and precisely as devastating as he needed to be. Serena had added more gently that she simply wanted to understand what the relationship actually was, and whether it was wise. Kwame had said nothing, though Abena told me later that he had looked uncomfortable. Then Victor had presented what he called a proposal, a formal termination of the fleet maintenance contract with appropriate compensation, a clear and professional end to the professional relationship. Simple, clean, no drama. He had slid a prepared document across the table. Abena had looked at it. She had picked it up. She had read it, all of it, in complete silence. And then she had set it back down, folded her hands on the table in front of her, and said 4 words that Victor had clearly not been prepared for. "Absolutely not," she said. "We're done here." She had stood up, thanked them for their time, and walked out of the room. Victor had called after her. She hadn't turned around. The house had been silent when she reached the terrace. It was silent now, as she sat across from me and told me about it. "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be," she said. "This conversation was always going to happen. I would rather it happened now. Your children are protecting you." "My children are protecting their inheritance," she said quietly. Then she caught herself. "That's not entirely fair. Serena is also protecting me, and Kwame is just lost." She paused. "Victor is protecting what he thinks is his." I didn't answer. She looked at me. "I need you to understand something, Kofi. I am not naive. I know how this looks from the outside. I know what people will say, and I know that some of what they say will be true. Not about you, but about the situation, about power, about money, about the fact that a woman in my position cannot love a man in yours without that love becoming a story that everyone needs to have an opinion about. Abena. I'm not finished. She was very still. I have spent 30 years building something real. I have earned the right to make my own choices, and I am not going to apologize for knowing what I feel. She looked at me. But I am also not going to be reckless with what we have. So I need you to be patient with me while I navigate this carefully. Not because I'm afraid, because I respect what this is. I nodded. Can you do that? She asked. I've been patient my whole life, I said. She almost smiled, and for a moment, sitting there in the warm evening air with the city murmuring beyond the garden walls, I almost believed that patience would be enough. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Victor was already planning, and none of us knew yet that the plan had already been set in motion. I found out about it on a Monday. My workshop manager, Abo, came to me mid-morning with the expression of a man carrying information he wishes he didn't have. He was a solid, careful person, 20 years in the industry, not a man who panicked or exaggerated, and when he sat across from me with that expression, I put down my tools. We have a problem, he said. The Osei Group logistics contract had been formally terminated, not by Abena. The termination notice had come from Victor Osei's office, signed by the company's secretary of the logistics division, citing a strategic decision to consolidate fleet maintenance under a single-vendor national provider. The contract represented 38% of our monthly revenue. I sat with that for a moment. 8 employees, rent on the workshop, parts suppliers I had accounts with. A small loan I had taken 6 months ago to purchase additional diagnostic equipment for the expanded contract. 38%. I thanked Ebo and told him to hold the information confidential for now. I walked out to the yard and stood in the Accra heat for a few minutes with the sound of the city around me and the very specific, very controlled kind of anger that my father had taught me is the only anger worth having. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that waits. I called Abena. She answered on the second ring. I know, she said before I could speak. Did you... No, I did not authorize it. Victor went around me through the divisional secretary. He has authority over the logistics division contracts up to a certain value threshold. A pause. The contract value was structured to fall just below that threshold. He had planned it in advance. He had known the exact number, which meant he had been preparing this before the family meeting. The meeting had been a warning, or perhaps a courtesy. The real move had already been made. I'm going to reverse it, Abena said. Don't, I said. A silence. Kofi, if you reverse it because of me, it becomes a public argument between you and your son over a mechanic from Nima. That's not a battle I want to win that way. Then how do you want to win it? I'll survive this, I said. I've survived worse. Another silence. Longer. I don't want you to just survive, she said quietly. I know, I said, but give me time. I hung up. I went back into the workshop, and I told Ebo to start looking for 2 new clients before the end of the month. He found 3. But Victor wasn't done. Over the following 6 weeks, I became aware of a pattern. Slowly. The way you become aware that the temperature in a room has been dropping for an hour, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, until you realize you are cold and have been cold for a while. 2 potential clients I had been in conversations with, a construction company and a freight forwarding firm. Both went silent after what had appeared to be promising preliminary discussions. No explanation. No declined follow-up. Just silence. The kind of silence that has a shape. A supplier I had used for 3 years informed me that my credit terms would be changing. New terms. Payment up front, effective immediately. No explanation given. When I called to understand, the manager was apologetic but firm. New company policy. A municipal transport contract I had tendered for, a tender I had prepared carefully over 6 weeks, and that Ebo believed we were well positioned to win, was awarded to a company that had submitted a higher bid. I was not paranoid. I was a mechanic. I understood how systems worked. I understood what it looked like when a mechanism was being deliberately interfered with. Victor Osei had resources I could not match, connections I could not access, a network that could make certain phone calls without ever using his own voice. I didn't tell Abena all of it. I told her the contract cancellation and left the rest. She had enough to navigate without becoming my protector, and I was not willing to be protected. Not that way. What I did instead was the only thing I knew how to do. I worked harder. I was at the workshop at 5 every morning. I took jobs that other garages turned down, complex restorations, vehicles that had been written off, electrical systems that other mechanics looked at and walked away from. I stayed late. I learned new diagnostic software. I applied for a government small business grant that I'd been putting off for 2 years. And I called my old friend Mensah Quarty, who had built a logistics startup in Tema, and who had, over the last 3 years, been quietly growing something important. I told him what was happening. Not all of it. Enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have a contract that needs a maintenance partner. I've been looking for 6 months. The last 2 companies I tried couldn't handle the workload." "Tell me the numbers," I said. He told me. The numbers were not as large as the Osei contract, but they were honest, and they were growing. And Mensah Quarty was the kind of man who paid on time and didn't make phone calls about your personal life. We signed an agreement by the end of the week. I didn't tell Victor this. I didn't tell anyone except Ebo. Let the silence work for me, for once. It was Kwame who came to find me. This was not something I had expected. He arrived at my workshop on a Thursday afternoon in a battered Honda Civic, which surprised me, given his family's resources, wearing jeans and a faded university sweatshirt. And he stood at the workshop entrance for a moment before Ebo called me over. He shook my hand with both hands, the way young men do when they are genuinely uncertain about how they are going to be received. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said immediately. "I want to be clear about that." "Come in," I said. We sat in the small office at the back of the workshop. I made tea. He didn't refuse it. He was quiet for a moment, turning the cup in his hands. Then he said, "My mother is happier than I've seen her in years." I said nothing. "I know that's not a comfortable thing for me to say to you, given everything." He looked up. "But it's true. And I think the truth matters more than whether the situation is comfortable." "It matters a great deal," I said. "Victor is convinced you're after the money," he said. He says it with complete certainty, like there's no other explanation that makes sense. He paused. "I don't know if he's wrong. I don't know you. But I know my mother, and she's not naive. She's never been naive about anything in her life." He hesitated. "She chose you, deliberately, with full information about everything you don't have." I met his gaze. "I'm aware of that. I'm not asking you to justify yourself to me," he said. "I'm just asking you." He stopped. Started again. "She's been alone in that house for 6 years. Even before my father died, she was alone. He was a good man, but he didn't see her. Not the way she needed to be seen." He looked down at his tea. "I don't want her to be alone again, just because Victor decided he knows best." I was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. He nodded. He seemed to exhale something he'd been holding. "I should tell you," he said, as he stood to leave, "that Victor has been meeting with someone. A lawyer. Private practice, not the company's usual firm." He said this carefully, looking at the wall rather than at me. "I don't know what they're discussing. But it started about 3 weeks ago. He left without saying anything else. I sat in the workshop for a long time after he was gone, with the sound of metal on metal coming through the walls, and the smell of engine oil, and the slow, certain feeling of something moving beneath the surface that hadn't yet broken through. A private lawyer, not the company's usual firm, 3 weeks ago. I went to find Ebo and asked him to cover the evening jobs. Then I drove to Abana's estate. She was waiting for me as if she had expected me, though I hadn't called ahead. The garden terrace, evening light, untouched coffee. When I sat down, she said, "Kwame came to see you." "Yes, I know. He told me he was going to." She looked at the city. "He's the most honest of the three of them. He doesn't know what to do with it yet, but it's there." "Abena," I said, "what does Victor know?" She was quiet for a moment. "The crickets, the city lights beginning to appear. He knows what I told him 6 months ago," she said carefully, "in a private conversation, something about the company, about my plans for the restructuring." She paused. "Something I have not yet made official." "What plans?" She turned to look at me. And in her eyes, behind the composure and the calm, there was something I had not seen before from this woman. Something that looked very precisely like the beginning of fear. "Kofi," she said slowly, "there is something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you before." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" I said. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at me, and she said, "I'm sick." The garden went very still. The warm air, the smell of night flowers, the city in the distance, indifferent and moving. "How sick?" I said. She took a slow breath. "Sick enough," she said, "that I had my estate attorney in 4 months ago to revise my will." The silence was different now. It had weight. It had edges. "Victor knows about the illness," she continued. "He doesn't know the full extent. He knows about the revision to the documents. He doesn't know the contents." She paused. "But he suspects that something has changed. And a man like Victor, when he suspects something has changed, does not wait to find out what." I understood now. The private lawyer. The 3 weeks. He wasn't just trying to remove me from his mother's life. He was trying to understand what he stood to lose, and he was already preparing. "Abena," I said, "what's in the revised documents?" She looked at me for a long, steady moment. "That," she said quietly, "is where the story becomes complicated." She told me over the next hour. The illness was a rare autoimmune condition. Serious, managed with medication, but with a trajectory her doctors had described as unpredictable. She had known for 11 months. She had told no one except her personal physician and her estate attorney. The revision to her will, the revision that Victor had somehow learned about without knowing its contents, was substantial. The Osei group had always been structured as a family holding, with the assumption that Victor, as the eldest, would inherit controlling interest. Augustine had set it up that way. It was what everyone expected, what Victor had been quietly planning around for years. Abena had changed it. She spoke carefully, choosing her words the way a person does when they have rehearsed a conversation many times and still aren't sure how it will land. She had restructured the inheritance to distribute equally among her 3 children, with an independent board appointed to oversee the business transition. She had also established a foundation, the Abena Osei Foundation, to be funded by a portion of the estate dedicated to education and technical training programs across Accra's underserved communities. And she had added one more provision, one that no one in the family knew about. One that, if Victor had found out, would explain everything that had happened in the last 6 weeks. She looked at me steadily when she told me. I sat very still. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the warm, heavy air of the garden pressed around us, as if the world itself were leaning in to listen. "You should know," she said quietly, "that this changes things, for both of us." "Tell me," I said. She took a breath. "Kofi," she said, "I'm 3 months pregnant." The word landed in the garden like a stone dropped into still water. Pregnant. I heard it. I understood it. And yet for a long moment, my mind simply held it at a distance. The way you hold a flame close enough to feel the heat, but not close enough to burn. Abina was watching me. Her hands were folded on the table, perfectly still, the posture of a woman who had already processed her own shock over many weeks, and was now watching someone else begin to process theirs. She did not look afraid. She looked honest, deeply, quietly, completely honest. 3 months, I said. Yes. You've known for 3 weeks, she said. I discovered it the same week I began noticing the other symptoms changing. My doctor confirmed both at the same appointment. She paused. I know this is a great deal to receive at once. It was. I sat with it. The crickets continued. The city continued. The world, indifferent to the particular earthquake happening on this terrace, simply moved on around us. Are you well? I asked. Both of you? Something in her face shifted. It was small, almost invisible, but I had spent enough hours watching Abena Osei's face to catch the things she tried not to show. What shifted was relief, that I had asked about the health first, before the implications, before the questions about what this meant, and what would happen, and what people would say. The pregnancy is stable, she said. The doctors are monitoring carefully, given my condition. But yes, so far, we are well. I nodded. I looked at her. Does Victor know? I asked. No one knows, she said. Only you and my doctor. He will find out. Yes, she said. He will. And when he does, it will be worse than anything that has already happened, she said quietly. I know that. I am not pretending otherwise. She held my gaze. Which is why I needed to tell you now, while we still have time to decide together how this goes. Together. I had spent 14 months on the edge of this family's world, welcomed through the side entrance, tolerated in the meeting rooms, despised at the dining table, and frozen out of the contracts. And here was this woman who could have managed this alone, who had the resources and the strength and the legal authority to manage everything alone, asking me to decide with her. Not for me, for us. I reached across the table and took her hand. She looked down at it. Whatever happens next, I said, I'm here. She looked up, and for a moment, just a moment, the composure broke. Not dramatically, not with tears or declarations, just a brief softening around her eyes, the kind that happens when someone has been holding something heavy for a very long time, and another person finally puts their hand on the other side of the weight. Then it was gone. The composure returned. The steadiness returned. Then we need to prepare, she said. We had 6 weeks before everything came apart. Abena moved carefully. She contacted her estate attorney, a woman named Akosua Darko, one of the most respected private legal practitioners in Accra, and instructed her to formalize certain provisions before the information became public. She also contacted her personal physician to establish a monitoring schedule that was, for the time being, discreet. She did not hide. That was important to understand. Abena Osei had never hidden from anything in her adult life, and she was not about to start. What she was doing was sequencing, managing the order in which truths were revealed, so that when the wall came down, it came down on her terms. I did my part. I told no one, not Abo, not Kwame, not Mensah Quarte. I continued my work. I continued building. I arrived at the estate for my arranged visits, and I sat in the garden with Abena, and I talked about ordinary things, The mechanics of a particular engine fault, the city planning disputes in Nima, a book she had recommended that I was reading in the evenings. And I let those conversations be what they were, real, unhurried. The quiet at the center of a storm that was building on all sides. But Victor was not idle. His private lawyer, I later learned his name was Asante, a sharp and meticulous man from a firm that specialized in estate contestation, had been meeting with him weekly. I don't know exactly what they discussed in those weeks. What I know is the shape of what was being prepared, because lawyers who specialize in estate contestation are preparing for one thing and one thing only: a challenge. Victor had decided, with the certainty of a man who has never seriously been denied anything, that whatever his mother had changed in her will, he would find a way to reverse it. What he didn't know was that Abena had already anticipated this. Serena came home from London for a long weekend in early January, and she came to find me, not at the estate. She came to my workshop. She arrived in a rental car, dressed in a way that split the difference between her London life and her Accra roots, and she sat across from me in the small office with the same careful precision she had shown at the dinner table months ago. But there was something different in her this time. The sharpness was still there, but underneath it, there was something that looked like conflict. "I owe you an apology," she said, without preamble. I waited. The dinner. The question I asked about your relationship with my mother. She held my gaze. "I was trying to embarrass you in front of the family. I'm not proud of it, and it wasn't fair." "You were protecting her," I said. "I was protecting myself," she corrected quietly. "My idea of what she should be, what this family should be." She looked down at her hands. "I think I've been confusing those two things for a while." I said nothing. "Is she all right?" Serena asked. The sharpness was gone. In its place was something younger, a daughter asking about her mother. "She seems different lately, quieter, but not sad. I don't know how to read it." I thought carefully about what to say. "Your mother is one of the strongest people I've ever known," I said. "And she loves her children more than she will ever say directly, because that's not how she's built. But she sees all of you clearly, especially the parts that are inconvenient." Serena looked at me for a long moment. "You're not going to tell me anything she hasn't decided to tell me herself," she said. "No," I said. She nodded slowly. Something that might have been respect moved across her face. "Then I'll wait," she said. She stood to leave. At the door she paused. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not much coming now, I think she chose well." She left before I could respond. I sat for a long time in that small office with the sounds of the workshop filling the walls around me, and I thought, when this comes apart, it will matter who is standing on which side. The night everything changed began with a phone call. It was a Wednesday, 11 weeks after Abena had told me she was pregnant. I was at home, eating dinner at the small table in my kitchen with the radio on low, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered. The voice was female, calm, professional. "Mr. Mensah? My name is Akosua Darko. I'm Mrs. Osei's estate attorney. I apologize for the late hour. I'm calling at her request." A pause. "She asked me to tell you that she's been admitted to hospital." My fork went down. "What happened?" "A complication related to her condition. The doctors are managing it, and she is stable. But she's been asking for you." Another pause. "She also asked me to tell you that Victor has arrived at the hospital and that you should be prepared." She said that last word carefully. I was already standing. "Which hospital?" She told me. I was in my truck in 4 minutes. The Accra Medical Center on the Liberation Road was one of the best private hospitals in the city, which meant it was well lit and hushed, and smelled of antiseptic and the particular terrible cleanliness that exists only in places where people come to face the things they cannot control. I walked in through the main entrance, and the first person I saw in the corridor outside the private wing was Victor. He was standing with his arms crossed, talking in a low, fast voice to a man I didn't recognize. The lawyer, I guessed, from the way he was listening, with a pen in his hand and a notepad barely visible beneath his arm. Victor looked up when I came through the door, and what moved across his face was not surprise. He had been expecting me. He had known Abena would call me. He stepped forward to intercept. "You should not be here," he said. His voice was low and controlled, but beneath the control there was something tight and stretched, something that had been running on certainty for months and was beginning to feel the ground shift. "Your mother asked for me," I said. "My mother is ill. She's not thinking clearly." "She asked for me," I said again. "You are not family." His jaw was set. "You have no standing here. Whatever you think is happening between you and my mother, it ends tonight. I am her next of kin, and I am telling you." "Victor." We both turned. Serena was standing at the end of the corridor, and next to her was Kwame. Both had clearly just arrived. Serena's expression was complicated, layered, processing, but her voice was steady. "Let him through," she said. Victor turned to look at his sister. "Serena." "She asked for him," Serena said. "The nurse told me herself. Let him through." A long, brittle silence. Victor's lawyer took a small, careful step back. The step of a man who has learned when to be invisible. Victor looked at me, and in his eyes, in that long moment, I saw what was really there. Underneath the arrogance, underneath the careful strategy, underneath the phone calls and the cancelled contracts and the private lawyer. Fear, not of me, of what he didn't control, of a world that was rearranging itself in ways he hadn't authorized. He stepped aside. I walked past him. Kwame put a hand briefly on my arm as I passed. 1 second, no words. And I kept moving toward the room where Abena was. She was propped against pillows, with monitors attached, and an IV line in her left arm, and the particular pallor of someone who had spent hours in a body that wasn't cooperating. But her eyes were clear, focused. When I came in, they found me immediately. "Kofi," she said. "I'm here," I said. I sat in the chair beside her bed and took her hand. Her grip was lighter than usual, but it was there. "It's not as bad as the corridor probably looked," she said. "My doctor says we are managing it, both of us." A faint emphasis on those last 2 words. "I know," I said. She looked at me. "Victor is outside. I saw him. He's been here for 3 hours." She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "He found out about the pregnancy." My hand tightened on hers. "How?" "I don't know. Someone talked. The hospital, perhaps. Or his lawyer found a way to access information he shouldn't have." She shook her head slightly. "It doesn't matter how. He knows. And Kofi—" She paused. "He intends to challenge the will. A Kosua has been notified. He's filed a preliminary notice of contestation. He's claiming that my relationship with you represents undue influence over my decisions, and that the recent revisions to my estate documents should be invalidated." She said it all evenly, without panic. Just information. Just the shape of what was happening. "He can do that. He can try," she said. "Akosua says the case is weak. My revisions were made 11 months ago, before we were anything more than professional acquaintances, which significantly undermines the undue influence argument. The pregnancy complicates things, for his argument, not for mine." She paused. "A child changes the inheritance calculations entirely. Under Ghanaian law, an unborn child has recognized succession rights. Victor knows this. His lawyer certainly knows this." I sat with that. The monitors beeped softly. The antiseptic air sat heavy around us. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Tomorrow," she said. "I want to call a family meeting. Here if necessary, or at the estate once I'm discharged. I want all 3 children present, and a Kosua. And I want you there." She held my gaze. "I am done managing this in private, in separate conversations, through careful silences. I am going to say everything. All of it. In one room. And I want you beside me when I do." I looked at her. "All of it?" I said. "All of it," she said. I nodded. "Then I'll be there," I said. She closed her eyes again. Her grip on my hand loosened slightly, not withdrawing, just resting. "Kofi," she said quietly, without opening her eyes. "Yes. Thank you for not being afraid of any of this." I looked at her face, at the lines around her eyes that the years of building something real had put there, at the mouth that had said, "I think I love you," with the same directness she used to discuss quarterly fleet figures, at the woman who had looked out of a car window at bread sellers and seen them. "I'm a mechanic," I said softly. "The only thing I've ever been afraid of is something breaking that I couldn't fix." She almost smiled. "And this?" she said. "This isn't broken," I said. "This is just hard." She was discharged the next morning. The family meeting was set for 4 o'clock at the estate. Not the dining room. Abina had specifically chosen the main sitting room, which was larger, more open, less of a courtroom. Small decisions, but deliberate ones. She understood the weight of space. I arrived at 3:30, as she had asked. Akoswadaka was already there. A composed woman in her mid-50s, with close-cropped natural hair and the particular stillness of a lawyer who has seen every version of family warfare and remains unimpressed by all of them. She shook my hand with a brief, firm grip and returned to reviewing her documents. Kwame arrived at 10 to 4, alone. He gave me a nod that carried something complicated in it. Relief, nervousness, the particular look of a young man who has decided to stand somewhere and isn't completely sure the ground is solid. Serena arrived at 4 exactly. Victor arrived at 4:05, with his lawyer, who Abina had not invited. She looked at the lawyer as he entered, then looked at Victor. "Mr. Asante is not part of this family," she said. Quiet. Flat. "He may wait outside." Victor's jaw tightened. A beat of silence. Then he looked at Asante and gave a small nod. Asante withdrew without expression. They sat. The room arranged itself. Abena in the high-backed chair she always used, Akosua to her right, me on her left. The 3 children on the opposite sofas, Serena upright, Kwame leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, Victor with his arms crossed and his face set like a man preparing for an argument he is certain he will win. The room smelled of polished wood and the faint sweetness of fresh flowers someone had placed on the side table. The afternoon light came through the tall windows in long golden bars. The portraits on the walls watched in their careful silence. Abena did not preamble. "I am going to speak," she said. "I am going to speak without interruption. When I am finished, each of you will have the opportunity to respond. If anyone interrupts before I have finished, I will ask them to leave the room, and we will continue without them." She looked at each of her children in turn. "This includes you, Victor." Victor said nothing. Abena began. She spoke for 23 minutes. I had heard most of it, not all. She had held certain things close, even from me. The way strong people hold the final few degrees of their vulnerability for the moment when it is most necessary, and then release it all at once. She told them about the illness, all of it, the diagnosis, the timeline, the prognosis. She spoke without drama, without self-pity, in the level voice of a woman who had already made her peace with difficult news and was now simply sharing information that her children deserved to have. Kwame put his head in his hands. Serena went very still. Victor's arms uncrossed. He leaned forward. His face, for the first time since I had known him, looked uncertain. She told them about the will revisions, what she had changed and why, the equal distribution, the independent board, the foundation. She walked through her reasoning carefully, not as a justification, but as an explanation. She had built this company. She had earned the right to decide what happened to it. She was deciding clearly and deliberately, with full capacity, as she always had. Victor started to speak. She raised one hand. He stopped. She told them about me. She was direct and simple, and she did not apologize for any of it. She described what had grown between us, not sensationally, not defensively, but honestly. She said that she had chosen deliberately and with full awareness of what she was choosing. She said that she had not been manipulated or influenced or confused. She said she was 51 years old and had spent 30 years building something and had earned the right to love someone who saw her clearly. She said his name, Kofi. And she looked at me briefly. And in that look, there was everything she had put into words in the garden that November evening, made visible in this room, in front of her family, without apology. And then she told them about the pregnancy. The room went completely silent. Not the polite silence of people choosing not to speak. The absolute silence of a room where time has briefly stopped, where three different people are processing three very different versions of the same information, and none of them can yet find the words. Kwame looked up from his hands. Serena's eyes closed and then opened. Victor stared at his mother. His face had gone through something remarkable in the space of about 4 seconds. Shock, then calculation, then something that looked, briefly, like a child who has been told something that reorders his entire understanding of the world. And then finally, the thing he always came back to, control. "Mother," he started. "I'm not finished," she said. He stopped. "I am telling you this," she said, "not to ask for your permission or your approval. I am telling you because you are my children, and you deserve to know the truth from me, directly, without it coming through lawyers or staff or rumors." She paused. "I am also telling you because I want this family to choose, with full information, who it is going to be. Whether it is going to be a family, or whether it is going to be an inheritance dispute wearing the name of a family." Silence. The chandelier light caught the crystal glasses on the side table. The gold-framed portraits were still. The afternoon had deepened outside the tall windows, the sky moving toward the particular amber of Accra at 5 o'clock, warm and heavy and unhurried. Abena looked at her children. "That is all I have to say," she said. Victor spoke first. He was controlled. He was always controlled. But underneath the control, for the first time in the year I had known him, there was something fractured, something that couldn't quite hold its shape. He said that he loved his mother. He said it simply, and I believed him. He said that he had acted out of concern, and I believed that too, partially. He said that nothing in her revelation changed his fundamental position, which was that the relationship I had with his mother was inappropriate and potentially damaging, and that the revised will should be reviewed independently. Abena listened without expression. Then he said something that he probably intended to be conclusive, but which landed differently in the room than he expected. He said, "A child does not change the fundamental situation." The room moved. It was subtle, a shift in posture, a redirected gaze. But I felt it, and Abena felt it, and I think even Victor felt it the moment the words were out. Serena looked at her brother. Something in her face had changed over the 23 minutes their mother had been speaking. The careful sharpness she had always carried was still there, but it was pointed in a new direction now. "Victor," she said quietly, "that child is our sibling." Victor turned to her. "What?" he said. "That child," Serena said again, with the patience of someone speaking to someone who has stopped listening, "is our sibling. Whatever you think about the circumstances, whatever you think about Kofi, whatever you think about the will." She paused. "Our sibling." Kwame looked up. He said, "Serena's right." Victor looked at them both, and in that look, in the space between his certainty and the ground that was no longer quite where he had put it, something happened that I had not witnessed before. Victor Osei, who had spent his entire adult life occupying rooms as if they were his by inheritance, looked, for one extended moment, like someone who did not know where to stand. Akosua, who had sat in perfect stillness throughout, opened the leather folder on her lap. "If I may," she said, in the unhurried voice of a woman who has been waiting for the right moment with the patience of someone who is paid very well to be patient. All eyes went to her. She removed a document from the folder and placed it on the low table at the center of the room. "Mrs. Osei's estate documents were reviewed and formalized 11 months ago," she said. "I can confirm, and I am prepared to confirm in any legal proceeding, that at the time of revision, my client was in full possession of her faculties, acted entirely of her own volition, and was not subject to any external influence. The revisions predated any personal development in her relationship with Mr. Mensah by a significant margin." She looked at Victor. "A contestation on the grounds of undue influence will not succeed. I would encourage your counsel to advise accordingly." Victor held her gaze. "Furthermore," Akosua continued, "under Ghanaian succession law, the child Mrs. Osei is carrying has recognized inheritance rights from the moment of confirmation of pregnancy. Any restructuring or contestation of the estate that fails to account for this will be legally invalid." She paused. "I have prepared the relevant documentation, which I am happy to share with Mr. Asante at his earliest convenience." She closed the folder. She folded her hands. She waited. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked twice. Victor looked at his mother, and Abena looked back at him, without triumph, without anger, with the same steady, clear gaze she had brought to every difficult room in her life. The gaze of a woman who has made her decision and is at peace with it. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," she said. "I never was. The company, the estate, your future, none of that has changed." She paused. "What has changed is that my life is also mine. It was always mine. I just needed to remind some people of that." Victor was quiet for a long time. The light outside had deepened to the last of the afternoon gold. The city hummed its constant, patient hum. Somewhere in the garden, Emmanuel the gardener was still working. 23 years, slow and careful, in a place that would never put his name on the door. Victor looked at me. I met his eyes. I didn't speak. I had nothing to prove in this room, and nothing to take from him. I was a mechanic from Nima. I had worn work shirts to board meetings and been told to stay in my lane, and watched my contracts disappear through phone calls I was never meant to trace. I had sat at the edge of this family's world for over a year and waited, and I was still here. After a long moment, Victor looked away. He looked at his mother. "Are you happy?" he asked. The question seemed to surprise even him, as if it had come from somewhere deeper than he had intended to go. Abena looked at her son. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He stood. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame, his back to the room. "I'll speak to Asante about the contestation," he said. His voice was even, controlled. "I'll let you know." He left. The room exhaled. Kwame let out a long breath and sat back against the sofa cushions. Serena stood and walked to her mother and sat on the arm of her chair and put an arm around her shoulders. A gesture so simple and so human that it cut right through the formal architecture of everything that had happened in that room. Abena leaned into her daughter's arm, and for a moment, the three of them, mother and daughter and son, incomplete but real, were just a family. I sat quietly and let them be that. Victor called Akosua the following morning and informed her that he was withdrawing the contestation notice. He sent no message to me, no apology, no acknowledgement, no gesture. I didn't expect one. But 3 weeks later, a formal letter arrived at my workshop from the Osei Group Logistics Division. New fleet maintenance contract, extended terms, full value. It was signed by Victor. There was no note attached. I filed it next to the Mensah Cordy agreement and told Ibo we were hiring. The months that followed were not simple. I want to be honest about that. Stories like this, the poor man, the rich woman, the family in opposition, have a version where once the wall comes down, everything becomes easy. Where love conquers and the family embraces and the house that was cold becomes warm and no one has to do any more hard work. That was not our story. Victor and I did not become friends. We became, over many months, slowly and without announcement, something more accurate than that. We became men who respected each other in the specific functional way that people respect each other when they have stopped pretending and started dealing with the reality that is actually in front of them. He was never warm with me, but he stopped being hostile. And he was, I noticed, quietly attentive to his mother in the months that followed. Present at the estate more often, less interested in the power and more interested in the person. Grief has a way of doing that to even the most armored hearts. The illness reminded him that the time was finite, that the arguments could wait, that there was a woman in that house who was both his mother and a full human being with a life that extended beyond her role in his. Serena and I found something that was easier and more honest than I had expected. She was direct, analytical, occasionally still too sharp for the room, and she never pretended she hadn't spent months viewing me with suspicion. We addressed it once, clearly, and then moved on. She was the one who sat with me in the hospital corridor during the difficult weeks of Abena's second trimester, and talked, quietly and practically, about the things that needed to be organized. Kwame became something I hadn't anticipated. A friend. It happened gradually. Conversations at the workshop, an afternoon of football, a growing ease that required no performance on either side. He was still figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. I told him one afternoon what my father had told me, that a man who understood how things worked could never be entirely powerless. He thought about it for a long time. 6 months later, he enrolled in an engineering program. He called to tell me first. Our daughter was born on a Thursday morning in April. The hospital room was quiet, except for the monitors and the first cry, sharp and immediate, and completely uninterested in the history that had preceded her arrival. Abena was exhausted and radiant in the particular way of women who have just done the most physical thing a human body can do. She held our daughter against her chest and looked down at her with an expression I had no words for. Something beyond love, something older and more elemental, the specific look of a person who has been trying to believe that something good was possible and is now holding the proof of it in their arms. I sat beside the bed, with my hand covering both of theirs. The morning light came through the hospital window, soft and imprecise, the way light is when you're not paying attention to it, because you're looking at something more important. "What do we call her?" Abena asked, her voice very quiet. I had thought about this for months. I had considered names from both our families, both our histories, the long, complicated lineage of where we had each come from, and what we had each carried to this room. And then I had remembered a word my father used. "Adwoa," I said. "It means peace." Abina looked at me, then she looked down at our daughter. Adwoa, she said, trying it. The baby's eyes opened slightly, dark and unfocused and entirely unimpressed, the way newborns always look, as if the world is merely a preliminary. Abina laughed softly. She has your expression, she said. My father's, I said. Same thing, she said. And she was right. Victor came to the hospital that afternoon. He came alone, without Asante, without a folder, without the careful armor of strategy. He stood at the door of the room for a moment, and then he came in and looked at his mother, and then he looked at the baby in her arms. His face did something complicated and human that I will not try to name. He crossed the room and sat down on the other side of the bed from me, and he looked at Adwoa for a long time. Then he looked at Abina. She's beautiful, he said. Abina held out her free arm. He leaned into it the way he probably hadn't since he was a child, without calculation, without management, without the elaborate superstructure of being Victor Osei, eldest heir, guardian of the family's reputation and the family's assets and the family's future. Just her son. I sat on my side of the bed. Adwoa slept between us, entirely unaware of everything she had already changed. 3 years later. The Mensah Auto Workshop on Nima Road had expanded twice. We now employed 19 people, operated a dedicated commercial fleet division, had a formal partnership with Mensah Quarty's logistics company, and had recently been awarded a municipal contract for the maintenance of public transport vehicles. The same type of contract Victor had once ensured I failed to win. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't mention it. My mother, who had grown up watching her husband work under engines and come home with grease under his nails and dignity intact, came to the workshop one Saturday and walked through the whole space slowly, looking at everything. She didn't say much. At the end, she stood at the entrance and looked out at the Nima Road and said, "Your father would have liked this." That was enough. The Abena Osei Foundation opened its first technical training center on a rainy Tuesday in June, in a building that had once been a disused warehouse 3 streets from where I had grown up. The center offered free 6-month programs in automotive mechanics, electrical systems, and logistics management. The first cohort was 43 students, ages 17 to 26, mostly from neighborhoods like Nima, Newtown, and Nima North. Neighborhoods that the marble floors of the Osei estate had never reflected. Abena spoke at the opening. I sat in the front row with Adwoa on my knee, 3 years old and entirely ungovernable and deeply interested in everything happening around her. Abena spoke about her late husband and about her father before him, and about the company they had built. Then she spoke about a morning on the Spintex Road when a car had broken down, and a mechanic had arrived who had fixed the alternator belt in 22 minutes and told her driver to have the full electrical system checked within 2 weeks. She said, "He fixed the car. But what he actually showed me was that the people this city overlooks, the people working in its heat and its traffic and its ordinary indignity, are the ones who keep everything moving. I had always known that intellectually. He made me understand it." The room was quiet. Adwoa pulled at my collar and said, with complete authority, "Dada." There was laughter. Abena smiled at us from the podium, that real smile, not the polished social one, and continued. Afterward, a 17-year-old boy from Nima approached me near the entrance. He had the look of someone who had dressed carefully for this occasion and was hoping no one would notice. He said, "Sir, are you actually a mechanic?" "Yes," I said. He looked at the building, then at me, then at Abena across the room. "And you ended up here," he said. The here encompassed more than the building. I could hear it. "I ended up where the work took me," I said. "And where I chose to stay." He nodded slowly. He went inside to register. Abena's health had stabilized. The autoimmune condition was managed, monitored, and, for now, not progressing. Her doctors were cautiously optimistic. She had adjusted the pace of her work, handed more operational authority to a professional executive team, and spent more time at the estate than she had in years. Not withdrawing, never withdrawing, just choosing differently. Victor had taken on a larger role in the company's restructuring, genuinely, not reluctantly. He was sharp and capable, and when he wasn't protecting something, he was actually excellent at building things. Abena had been right about his grandfather's stubbornness. What she hadn't said out loud, but what I had come to see, was that his grandfather's capacity was in there too. Underneath the armor, he still wasn't warm with me. I had stopped expecting warm. What we had was real, and real was enough. Serena had returned from London permanently and was leading the Foundation's financial strategy with the same precision she brought to everything. She and Adwoa had a relationship that surprised everyone, including Serena herself. The baby had decided, for reasons entirely her own, that her older sister was her favorite person in any room, and Serena, who had never been particularly interested in children, had discovered that she was completely helpless against this particular 3-year-old. Kwame had completed his first year of engineering school. He was not the best student in his cohort, but he was the most persistent, and he had a quality his professor had described in an end-of-year report as an unusual ability to understand why a system fails, rather than just how. I told him his grandfather would have liked hearing that. He had looked at me, just for a moment, with something that needed no words. I still drove the second-hand Toyota pickup. Abena had offered, multiple times, to replace it. I had declined, multiple times, with the simple explanation that it was still running, and I understood all its problems, and there was no reason to give up on a functional vehicle just because a better option was available. She had given me that real laugh, the one that was almost a sound of surprise, and said, "You are the most stubborn man I have ever known." "I prefer patient," I said. "They're the same thing in the end." I had smiled at her. The truck made its particular sound, shifting into third gear on the drive through Accra's morning traffic, past the bread sellers and the school children and the men pushing carts through the exhaust fumes with the slow, steady dignity of people who have no choice but to keep moving. I watched them the way Abena had watched them from the back window of a broken-down Mercedes on the Spintex Road 3 years ago. Like they mattered, they did. On the evening of our 3rd anniversary, we marked it from that November evening in the garden, because that was the real beginning. We sat together on the terrace with the city lights beginning to appear in the distance, and Adwoa asleep inside, and the cricket sound that had accompanied every important conversation we had ever had, doing its quiet, faithful work in the garden. Abena was looking at the city. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she said, "if the car hadn't broken down?" "Yes," I said. And I think there would have been something else," I said. "A different road, a different morning. I think when two people are supposed to find each other, the world makes arrangements." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a romantic thing to say for a mechanic." "Mechanics believe in systems," I said. "Systems work when their parts are in the right relationship to each other." I paused. Maybe people are the same. She turned to look at me, that real smile. "Your father was a philosopher," she said. "He was a mechanic," I said. "Same thing in the end." She took my hand. The city moved in the distance, indifferent and constant, full of people keeping everything running. In the heat, in the traffic, in the ordinary, necessary, invisible labor of hands that know how things work. The gates of the Osei estate were closed. They had always been a symbol, but symbols change. The gates were mine now too, not because I had taken anything, because I had stayed. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of Kofi's patience, Abena's courage, and the long, complicated road to a love that refused to be diminished, then subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to believe that dignity survives. Leave a comment telling us which moment stayed with you, because the next story is already waiting, and it begins the same way all the best ones do, with a secret that's been kept too long. Stay with us.